Mindcrime Liberty Show. Me, Swin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, was female education a mistake? Now, a lot of the time in the media, especially from the sort of liberal left, it's like, female education was the greatest thing ever. And they'll always complain about, if they do complain about immigrant groups, always because they're backward to when it comes to female education and women's rights, quote unquote, etc. So I thought it would be interesting to discuss, well, firstly, how has female education changed over the past 100, 200 years or so, and whether it's been a good thing or a bad thing, or or even before then, how it has impacted society as a whole. So it might be worth defining female education here. So I suppose what I mean here by female education is sort of standard sort of academic education, which in its widespread sense only really comes down to industrialization. So in the UK context, that starts with sort of compulsory primary education from 1871, and then it progressively gets higher and higher until you get the sort of typical post-war position where school leaving was 16, so you have like an academic education up until then. I'm not sure, I think it may have been 18 in the US earlier than it is in the UK. That was, in England, that was only in recent past. And so that's the kind of education, rather than, because clearly it wasn't the case that girls didn't learn anything. It's just what they learned, and what they would have learned prior to sort of 1870 or whatever would have been predominantly handicrafts, things around the home. Now they would have worked outside the home in the industrialized period, and took their kids there to some extent as well. So there is sort of a transitional period, but if they were to be taught to be on the job sort of stuff, and it wouldn't be this sort of academic formal education that is sort of like the default setting today. I got, now take these numbers with a grain of salt, but they do seem broadly accurate. I got AI to come up with how female university entrance changed in the UK over time. So in 1870, they recorded approximately 200 female students, and in 1860 there weren't any. And you can see that you have a pretty rapid increase actually from sort of about 1880 to sort of like 1960, up from like 1.5% of the female population between 18 and 25, which then goes up to 6.8%. But then it really gets in an elevator in 1970 and goes to like 20% of the female population. And you can see that I'm reading the wrong chart. It goes to it goes up to 12%, 3% in 1960, not 6. And then it gets up to 12% in 1970, then 15% in 1980, 20%, and now it's projected to be near 60% in 2020. And since 2010, since 2000, the percentage of females between 18 and 25 going to university is actually more than the male population. And so it's changed rapidly. So, up until 2000, you have more, 1990, we have more males going to university than females. So there's a big sort of change. Now, then the question of university as well is what do they study? Generally speaking, the females have tended towards people studies rather than stuff. So you get far more men in engineering, maths, STEM subjects, law, whereas women tend towards psychology, design, social sciences, medicine, to a large degree. Although medicine covers a great variety of subjects, including nursing, physiotherapy, etc. They do get a lot of business. The highest one, according to the AI thing I looked at, was was also business, which was the same for men, but the other subjects were different, and depending on how they approached the different things in business is going to be different, because there's going to be lots. Business is a very, very broad subject. The question of where they would fit in there is quite is quite different. So the general trend seems to be, more formal education for both males and females, but we now have a situation where more girls and women go into university education than they do males. Tim, is the situation in America somewhat similar, different, or otherwise compared to the UK situation?
Sure, it's very similar. I don't really think I have too much more to add there. It's probably almost identical.
Yeah, my understanding was very similar. So then the question arises, well, what has this actually done society-wide? So one thing it seems to have done, and this was apparently a very robust finding, is that female education reduces the birth rate substantially. Why this is the case? Well, there's a number of different explanations. One is that they tend to delay marriage, and so they don't have as much time to be able to have it. Having children, typically as well, if they earn more money and they've trained, a lot of people will go, well, okay, I've spent all this money, etc., going to university, getting debt, train in a particular area. I need to get return on that investment, and children get in the way of that return on investment, and so therefore they don't have as many, or they'll have them much later. That tends to be the main thing as well. Also, as well, it might make people think that because they had a lot of sort of money spent on them individually, that they need to spend a lot on their own children, the sort of so-called quality quantity trade-off, so that they try to replicate that with their own children and so have fewer. That seems to be a rather robust finding, as my research seems to indicate. So that's one major impact. Another impact of this is that one of the things why it might delay marriage, and by marriage here as well, I also include sort of like cohabitation as well, is that there's robust and consistent findings that that women really do not like marrying down. They do not want to look like they have married somebody of lower socioeconomic status. And given the fact that there's more women going to university than men are, then that means that the pool of men whom they would consider marriageable is substantially lower, which will then reduce the marriage rate. So that's another impact that it would have. I mean, related to that, I had looked at some findings to say that if the wife has higher IQ than the husband, then that's a very big predictor of divorce. Now, it's not true that I'm not saying education makes you more clever necessarily, but I'm just giving you a related sort of data point, which is sort of consistent with that. So you have a situation where birth rates are lower. You have birth rates are lower. It probably delays marriage because, well, it does insofar as it means that men don't earn. Well, there's not as many men have university education as the women do. Also, as well, I think as more recently, women between the ages of sort of 20 and 30, on average, more than single men do on those age groups as well. And that seems to be an outcome of it as well. Clearly, as well, it means that women, as it were, to some extent, are more financially independent of men, which you could argue is a good thing because they not have to be sucked into bad and not sucked into, but kind of trapped in bad marriages. It has also allowed a greater amount of people for corporations and companies to choose from, which you would expect could have a downward trend on wages in certain markets. Whether it would have an impact on overall wages would largely depend on whether women coming into the labor market would increase or decrease average productivity. Because so this is interesting with immigration, is when you look at see what the impacts on immigration is going to be on wage rates, you've not only got to take into account the increased supply, but also the increase in demand of that. Because they earn more, they can spend more. So whether or not the average wage rate goes up or down is going to be dependent on basically how productive they are, or adding them to the labor force. What does it do to that? Another impact, female education, at least indirectly, would be increased house prices, because you have higher incomes, and then it means that banks can lend more money so they can spend more and bid up the prices of houses. There seems to be a certain impact. There are probably more, but an interesting finding, which was quite funny with DeepSeek complaining, I think I mentioned Tim before, was if you look at happiness data, so self-reported happiness, female happiness seems to go down from the 1970s onwards, which the AI bot was very pains to point out. Oh no, this is to do with the feminist revolution was insufficiently radical. We haven't remodeled society. But now, whether it was unclear as to whether more education made you unhappier or not, but it does sort of tie together higher. One of the standard feminist arguments of why women are more unhappy was the alleged double shift, whereby the woman would work outside the home for a while and then do all the stuff that she would have traditionally done at home, where had a lazy husband who was working all day but probably didn't do very much and just demanded all stuff to be done for him while I sat down. And so that can double shift, but that's clearly all related and tied in with increased female education. So those seem to be some broad implications of the increased female education. Tim, is there anything on there that you think is dubious, or any pushback on any of those impacts, or any other additional impacts I haven't yet mentioned?
I'd have some comments I could make, but I don't have anything specifically.
Go for it. Comment. Go.
Milo Yiannopoulos in a debate said that feminism not only succeeded, it has surpassed. What we really need is men's rights. That's what Milo Yiannopoulos said in debate about feminism, which I thought he smashed. You can hate Milo Yiannopoulos for whatever reason you want, but I think there he did a perfectly fine job. So as you state, in terms of schooling success, women have done remarkably better, or markedly better. That is one of the things which annoys me about the normie right, and even much of the moderately reactionary right, is they still at times act like it is a potential movement rather than like a movement that's already happened. It's already happened. If it could go up to 75% to 25%. I don't know when people will start noticing this. 3/4 of my college professors were women. I think 4/5 of my elementary school teachers were women. 3/4 of my middle school and high school were women too, or something like that. A high percentage. In high school, it's a little different, but I mean, you can make a statement like schooling itself is bad. You can go full Brian Kaplan, that'd be the right-wing version, or full Ivan Illich, that would be the left-wing version. But even private religious schools and even some homeschooling, I'm gonna have to say this, still typically have the same formula, just in slightly different flavors as mainstream or public education. Now, not to contradict myself about this, our only female guest we've had on, I made the point that the quote unquote lizard elite. I mean, I'm not referencing David Icke specifically, but I'm using that as a metaphor. The lizard elite are still quite patriarchal. So, yes, there are random Scandinavian states and random states in the Pacific Northwest or governments that have all females in them, but are they really in charge, with quotes? Like, who's really in charge? So maybe at the top level of the pyramid, that's still all a bunch of people who can't, non-birthing people, LOL. Now, my pushback to you over this whole episode, which I think we've discussed, was mistake to whom? I mean, we did an episode on why do people have children, and I think one of the problems for the reactionary right, let alone the normie right, is the why do people have children question. Like they sort of just assume the zero fertility is undesirable. Now, one quick response is say, well, monks and nuns have zero fertility. Jesus and Paul have zero fertility. Again, you could get in disputes over Paul's exact history, but maybe we assume. But like the zero, there is arguments to make zero is not necessarily in itself a bad thing. And people like John Stuart Mill, the reason John Stuart Mill spent a night in jail was he's advocating for birth control, but he wanted to reduce the population. So he wanted lower population. I had a religious studies professor in college who was an ex-Christian minister at my private liberal arts college, and he made the quip, 8 billion people, that's enough. That's enough. So like the zero fertility thing is the same thing. We also did an episode of marriage. Is marriage slavery? Some people would say, and I think, is marriage slavery is an interesting question to ask, like the reactionary right, considering what marriage laws are in the modern society. So like, again, the idea of not getting married itself is something that, like, well, why is marriage in itself desirable? Now, maybe it is, but you have to sort of like argue. You can't just say, well, the statistics say that females' education decrease because it creates a marketing game where women have marrying down versus marrying up. And that's sure. I agree with the empirical claim and the sort of commonsensical claim, but then you have to make the argument whether or not marriage in itself is desired and the decline of marriage. Because some people will say the decline of marriage is in itself a good thing. And also your increased house prices. I mean, who's that good for? That's good for bankers. That's good for the Federal Reserve. That's good for realtors. That's good for finance. It's good for boomers with reverse mortgages. If you want to talk about generational politics, boomers and people who already own homes love increased house prices. Now, if they have to, especially if you're downsizing, because you could sell your house and then buy a much smaller house, you still have to buy an increased house price, but you take that huge equity you have and just live off that equity, basically. So that would be my response to you. And the only thing is the double work shift thing, that seems to be a problem for only poor people, I'll say, or I think in Richard Spencer's comments upon abortion, on people of lesser means. That's a problem for single mothers, and things like that, or people who have bad husbands or wives, but oftentimes husbands, or wives. We'll be sympathetic to the men's rights thing. Like, that just seems to be a poor household management. Like if both spouses work and one spouse does nothing at the house, I mean, it could be that because he's not interested in doing that, or maybe you shouldn't have got married in the first place, or like you'd have just different levels of like cleanliness desires things, and these things show up here. Like, so like that is like a micro problem, but like that to me is one of the most petty things. But as far as the other questions, a mistake to whom? That'd be my response to you with it on this episode and your points you're making. I mean, I empirically, all your points are, I mean, to the extent that empirical evidence is true, I would say it's true.
No, you're right about who it's good for and who it's not. Because I mean, if you were to say, okay, who have been the primary beneficiaries of female education, of increased female membership of the labor force, landowners and corporations, really, because they've had much more a greater level of choice over their workers. Also, they tend to get. I think we discussed this in we had an episode something about women and sort of like corporations and whether corporations was working for corporations for them good or a bad thing.
The episode title was "Why do Marxists support women's emancipation if they think corporations are exploitative?" That was the technical episode title.
Yeah, that's the one. So we discussed it there, and it's like, well, let me think. So it's, they can work there, and they tend not to be they tend to be more disagreeable than men do. They will be there to help enforce corporate policy, and it's really been a big boon to sort of the managerialization of the economy. So if you take sort of James Burnham and the managerial revolution, women entering the workforce has clearly helped sort of managerialism. I mean, this is probably sort of like best seen in like human resource departments tend to be stocked largely with females, and they seem to be loyal members of the regime, as it were. So that would seem to be the primary beneficiaries of it. It does seem to be the case that for a lot of women, if you look at, we discussed this before, and it depends on how you want to best interpret this, but it is consistently the case that women will intend to have more children than they actually do have. Now, you could argue, did they ever really have the intention to begin with? But when it comes to all the education, all the formal education taking out of the sort of marrying market, at least for a time, and working longer before having children, etc., that's clearly going to have an impact. And there's one of the biggest causes of the decreased birth rate is single women with no children. They're the biggest cause of it. And the question really is, well, it's not a real question, but are they actually better off? Do they feel like they're happier in that case? To which the answer is almost certainly not. And the thing is entirely consistent with the happiness data. It seems to be the case for the vast majority. Now, you can talk about nuns and monasteries, which is an interesting aside to mention. But most women will want to get married, like whether technically married on the legal sense, not, but effectively, and have children. I mean, that's pretty much true of a vast majority of women. Now, there will be some who have sort of been inculcated out of that by the media, and there was probably always a small minority who didn't. But then the vast majority will want to do that. And who do they want to marry? Well, they typically want to marry a guy who is of higher socioeconomic status. They want him to be slightly more intelligent. They want him to be strong. They want to earn more than they do, and basically do all the things that everyone would expect them to want, but aren't really allowed to say because they're supposed to be strong, independent women. And the whole women being in education and wanting to earn as much as men do, it's like, oh yes, we want to earn the same as you, except I only want to marry someone who earns more than me. I was like, okay, that's going to work well, isn't it? So it seems to me to be clear, for at least for a lot of women, that it's made it worse off. Now, for some women, it's made them better off. I think that's true. If you're someone who never had any interest in children or marriage at all, it meant that you could earn substantially more as a single woman. That's true. And for some, I mean, if you could have a situation where they can do like a high skilled job and maybe do it part time easily, then you could say that they would be able to have a number of children and be married and also have this sort of extra piece of income or interesting job that you can do. That could certainly be the case. But if you look at a lot of women, I mean, if you go, it's probably the same in the US. If you go to go to like Walmart, Target, or the sort of big retailers, their stock, the main staff, if they're not immigrants, are middle-aged women who don't look hugely happy. That's what I typically see in a lot of shops, and so it doesn't seem to be that great for them. When it comes to, you mentioned on, birth rate's good or birth rate bad. That's an interesting question. We could do a whole episode on, what's the optimum population. But if it's the case that people leave the labor force and you don't maintain, if you have the same population and then the amount of people working goes down and productivity doesn't increase at the same rate, that means on average everyone is poorer. So that would be the impact there. I would mention with the birth rates, but you are right. Birth rates are a broader issue. Any comments on who actually it's good for and who it's bad for, etc.?
I don't mean to be facetious or duplicitous regarding the good question, because there might be such a thing as overall good. You want to advocate, and you say, well, overall, in the universal sense of the word good, are these people living a good life? Are these people doing good things? And I think that's a hard question to answer. But my inclination is to agree with you in general, to state that the effects of this have been somewhat negative. But it is also the case that for high IQ white women, it's arguably, or even middle IQ white women, it's arguably beneficial. If anything, there are the number one beneficiaries of it. That's one of the weird hidden contexts of feminism, is that feminism as an ideology is largely WASPs, WASPs par excellence. People think about it, there isn't really a third or second world. And by second world, I mean formal Soviet sphere and China. Yes, they're feminists in Marxist societies, but it's been pointed out that Russia is more quote unquote backwards in many ways. Although whether it still is not a question, but this is largely a phenomenon of Germany, United States, and the Catholic countries, France, Spain, Italy, and Argentina and South America Brazil play a role, but it's really WASP ideology. Yes, Catholics play a role here in the West, but is it good for them? Well, this goes back into these pedantic philosophical questions of what is good. Now, I do think that elites at some point will recognize that having negative or declining populations is a problem. But that's still to me a while. You get fringe elites like Elon Musk's. You ask, depending on who you ask. If you ask Keith Preston, is Elon Musk, or Kurt Metzger, is Elon Musk part of the elites? They'll say no, he's just a front man for some other power group. So, but Elon Musk will talk about, the fact that we don't have 2.3 fertility rates is a problem. Although for the religious, one of the white pills for the religious people, this is made in the book, Fundamentalist Shall Not Hurt the Earth, the fact that so many of your quote-unquote enemies are having 0 children just means in 50 years, you're going to maintain a higher percentage of the existing population. Now, immigration will throw some wrinkles into that. But if you just think about Britain's quote-unquote white population, if the white English are having 5 TFR, a fertility rate of doubling, well, let's just say, or 4, we'll stick to that, and everyone else has a 0, in 40 years, you're going to be doing all right. If you buy any of the genetic heritability stuff. Now, of course, if you bring in huge numbers of immigrants, that poses a problem. But so that's a white pill for you. So in a strange sense, you should be glad that your enemies are aborting their children, or your enemies are advocating this stuff, and so forth. So I sometimes think about this stuff. I tend to hold Keith Preston's views when it comes. I tend to hold Keith Preston's views for the wrong reasons, and to some extent right reasons, for the sort of overall philosophical good position. I don't think it's good for them individually, but whether it's good for Hillary Clinton that she got to be Secretary of State, I don't know. like, I don't know, would Hillary Clinton or the current, Ivanka Trump, or you can name some other, Margaret Thatcher, or I can name some conservative, quote unquote, right wing women, quote unquote right wing, or quote unquote left wing women in politics. Like, or is it good for them? I think it's quite obvious that it was good for them. Is it good for the people who work at Walmart? That's a better question. That to me is the interesting question that Marxists don't fully take seriously, and the left doesn't take fully seriously. And I'd argue that's where their sort of elite aspiration of politics comes out. So, like, when egalitarianism fails, we just get into this sort of weird game of elite aspirationism, and it's like, well, you like, that person at Walmart didn't become Hillary Clinton or the CEO of Lockheed Martin. Yes, the CEO of Lockheed Martin for a while was a woman. But like, what for them, it's clearly a failure to some extent. But like, what was their alternative life prospects before then? And I would say those are good questions to ask. This is a very interesting topic. I mean, I think we only ever do what I would view as interesting topics for the most part. The only episode I ever thought that was boring was the is arranged marriage thing. That was probably the only episode I ever thought was. We've done a few boring episodes, but like the whom question, I think, is the key part of this, which needs to be fleshed out for it to be like tangible. You might be able to send, is a grandmother with 8 grandchildren happier than someone who never had children? Well, if they became an effective CEO or an effective golfer or something, or tennis player or something like that, then maybe. But if they just worked a minimum wage job at Walmart or something like that, or even like just as a teacher, I don't know. Would they have been better off children? Maybe. But then you have to ask, well, why didn't they do that in the first place? And this is where I think Brian Kaplan's selection effects also kick in. The people who tend to get married and have children tend to be more likely to, like if you make everything, like in today's, if you make everything about choice, like the people who are going to choose to do something. So, like, since marriage is not like forced or expected in the way it might have been 150 years ago, the only people who get married anymore are the people who want to or need to. Now, there is the sort of the sex side of things, and there's that side of things. But like, thanks to birth control, that's been to some extent divorced. So it's not like people just have, especially in the upper and middle classes, people don't just have sex and they have children naturally. Like, the link isn't 1-to-1. So that kind of shotgun marriage stuff doesn't happen as much anymore. So like, the only people, this is where Kaplan's selection effects come. The only people who get married today are people who really want to. Now, Charles Murray is another entrant. I always like to bring up the governor of California's wife. I'm pretty sure the governor of California's wife is a stay-at-home mother. I think she has like a no-show job as a charity. I always like to bring this family up because I think this is like the best bourgeois family par excellence. And Charles Murray's point is, some of the elite think left and live right. I think there's no better example of that than the governor of California. Yes, Gavin Newsom might be a lizard person. He probably is a lizard person. He probably communes with aliens at 2 a.m. every night. I don't know. But on the surface, he lives a sort of like paradigm bourgeois, somewhat traditional marriage by the 1980s standards. That'd be my comments on that. Who is this a mistake to?
I think that leads quite nicely on to how female education could be altered or possibly abolished. Now, clearly, it's the case that the education system needs to be altered for boys and males in general as well. But in particular, when it comes to women, it's going to be, I suppose it depends on, what are they training for? What are they learning for? What are they intending to do? And so if it's going to be, so given the fact that it would seem, given it being the case that women seem to want to have children, most of them want to spend some time with them. So, for instance, and when we had first child, second one, a lot of women who my wife knew were like, I'd rather want to stay with child, but I've got to go back to work and have the money for it to not do that. So it seems to be the case now. Granted, that's anecdotal, but I'm sure I thought of researching that, but I couldn't really figure out exactly what question to look for to figure that out. That's what they intend to do. That they want to do. They want to have kids. They want to have a husband who, as I say, earns more and whatever. So the question is, how should you direct education with that goal in mind? Well, for one thing, you might look like more traditional education, by which I mean learning things about household management, for one thing. But again, though, I would say that would be also true of male education. That is, you could actually go out to workplaces from a relatively young age and learn how things actually work, rather than being in school. But insofar as you're going to do formal education, it would seem to me that what would make the most sense for, especially given technological society we currently live in, it would make sense for women in general to train in areas which they are able from a relatively young age to work independently or be effectively self-employed and work from home, for which there are many different things you can do that now. I mean, for instance, and I have another problem with my body, and I have a problem with my shoulder, and so I see a physio, and the physio was good, seemed to know what they were doing, and did it online. So that's one example of something you could train to do. Also consultancy, different things, like contract work or whatever you could do from home. Now, why do I mention this? Is because this is a way in which, well, one, you've got some of them independence and not just be tied to a corporation. And it would be also a way of supplementing income, but also be something you could fit in around children and the household in general. So in effect, in a sense, it would be a more modern version of working on the farm, whereby you had the integration of kids around you or doing a particular occupation while they were like chasing after the pigeons or something to stop them eating the crops or something like that. That would seem to me to be the areas in which female education would make the most sense in general. And then, of course, if it was that they wanted to sort of be high flying and earn more and can make a lot of money, then fine on sort of edge cases. I mean, so having a few women who earn a lot isn't necessarily a problem, as long as there's always a guy who earns more than her. Because then that would be successful, assuming they will marry, they'd be successfully married in that case, and not have sort of that issue of the woman can't find a man who thinks is good enough, for instance. But that's the way I think female education would make the most sense, rather than going, oh yes, we're going to get all these women into these occupations and like STEM fields and stuff, which to a large degree they don't want to do anyway. And then this would help to have like a more of an integrated existence and also give them more independence from large corporations. But of course, they would be subjugated by the husband, which of course is a bad thing, clearly. But that would seem to me to be like a more sensible way going forward. So rather than saying, oh, yeah, don't train them in anything, because of course there's always the problem if they don't get married, then they don't have any way of making any income. So it seems to make sense to be able to, but also not do the current system, which seems to make them less happy and society worse. Any comments, pushback, or anything on that, Tim?
No, I think to me the questions is how bad do you think how bad do you think it'll get for boys before elites start noticing that education is a failure for boys? This might be too much of a far afield topic, but like that's something I sometimes think about. Like, based on your numbers you sent me, it's 60% girls in education, from my understanding, in higher education in the UK. Like, where do you think that's going? Do you think that's going to go up higher? No, you could always take the Illich, Kaplan, Foucault. There's more. I think there's a reactionary Catholic who's made this argument too, that this is actually a good thing that boys are dropping out of education. The problem I see with that is education still serves as sort of like and Kaplan will admit this, is it's an elite, like It's an elite aspirant. It's people. The fact that people care about education means people care about education. Whether or not education is good itself is a good thing. But how bad do you think it will get before boys? People start noticing that boys, or do you think that's, or do you think to go back to the, do you think elites think that's actually good that boys are doing badly? I mean, you could ask like, do elites think that it's good that boys are, failing mainstream education? Swithin, what do you think?
That's interesting. In the UK now, there is more awareness of alternatives to universities. So a lot of like apprenticeship things, and not just in traditional manual occupations, but you can do apprenticeships at corporations. So, for instance, I taught a guy who ended up getting an apprentice position at no, it wasn't Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan. And other things like it was accountancy apprenticeships and things. So there's more awareness of these sorts of things. Now, I'm not sure on the male-female uptake of those. Whether the elites, in a sense, I think whether the elites think it's good that the males are flunking out is actually to some extent, I think, to what extent the elite men want to be polygamists. Because to the extent that they can render a lot of male population undesirable means that they can have effectively their own harems and have more of them, because it's a way of just reducing competition. But the problem is, though, of course, it means output goes down. So in some of the research stuff, I went back over some interpretation of J.D. Unwin's work, and the interpretation that he gives of Unwin as to why sort of what Unwin refers to as absolute monogamy, where there's lots of restrictions on female sexual activity, and they're the most virile and dominant societies, is essentially that men know that they've got high confidence the children are theirs, and they're willing to put the effort in to make sure their kids do well. And then this drives the economy, essentially. And if you have a situation where either men don't know if their kids are theirs and or don't have any, then that's productive energy is going to be put into internet forums and gaming, which, is fine to some extent. And eventually that's going to be a problem because you're not going to be able to keep sort of bleeding the economy, as it were, to get not, you need less blood to bleed for the elites to live off. So it will become a problem at some point. The question is when. But there's also entrenched interest to maintain the education system as it is. I mean, it provides so many jobs, and a lot of the education system is built on, you got to climb up the rung of the ladder. So ultimately, all the schooling system is justified by university. Why do you want to go from primary to secondary? Oh, yeah, because then you can go to secondary, and then you can go to further education, then you go to higher education, because that's where you want to go. So I think there's a lot of inertia when it comes to that. But there does seem to be more awareness of how the education system really isn't fit for purpose. I don't know. It's hard to say with that.
I'm basically finished here. There's an idiotic article that came from the New York Times back in June, and its subtitle is "Men, Please Come Back," or "Men, Where Have You Gone?" So many have dropped out of society. I only get one article a month I can read from the stupendous New York Times, so I can't get the precise things, but you can sort of summarize from the headline. So maybe some elites are at least projecting that they're noticing this stuff, but I do wonder. I will just say that the non-normie right needs to take seriously men's issues because no one else will. That's one of my sort of like tactile things. Like, and if you do know any young boys, whether you're sons, whether you're, I don't know, sibling sons, or whether they're in churches or private organizations or other organizations, take an interest in them, because there's a way in which like formal society, and this includes like official Christian organizations. This is something that bothers me, is they still toe the feminist line in the sense that we need girls and we need, women's empowerment and stuff. So it's still in like sort of mainstream Christian organizations, this line is still that. So that would be my like if you want like concrete advice to fix this, I would say that would be one thing to do. Like, make sure, take an interest in take a sort of occupational and hobby interest in young boys and or older boys for that matter too. That'd be my. I don't really have any further comments. Very interesting topics and thanks for doing it.
I'd agree. A lot of the time it's is this typical society thing? If men aren't doing things, it's their fault, and if women aren't doing things, it's men's fault. And to some extent that's true in that men have more agency, but the advice and sort of recognition of the problems and trying to help them in constructive ways is severely lacking in many cases. So shout out to Home Math as being a good guy to help with that kind of thing in general. So yeah, and I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibityshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibityshow@gmail.com.